I'd like to welcome you to No Greater Love's candlelight ceremony to remember all those children who died as a result of the conflicts in the Persian Gulf beginning in August 1990. This ceremony, the first of its kind, recognizes the most innocent victims of war, the children. How appropriate it is that we honor these victims of war on the International Day of Peace. 1 hour ago at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, with the ringing of the peace bell, the UN Secretary General called upon people throughout the world to work toward the universal goal of peace. This ceremony is sponsored with the cooperation of the United Nations Peace Studies Unit. No Greater Love is one of the United Nations Peace Messengers, designated in recognition of our concrete and positive contribution in promotion of world peace. Today's event is one of those contributions. No Greater Love helps to bring about the peace through young citizens of the world. No Greater Love vocalist Bebe Gribble and the Young Americans of Washington, under the direction of Richard Hartzell, will open our program with the song, I Am But a Small Voice. They will be accompanied by Mary Lou McDonald and Muriel Farley on the guitar.
I am but a small voice, I am but a small dream, to smile upon the sun, be free to dance and sing, be free to sing my song to everyone. Come, young citizens of the world, citizens of the world, we are one, we are one. We have one hope, we have one dream, and with one voice we sing. Give us peace,
speaker is Ambassador Bruce Langan, who spent many years in the Middle East in a variety of diplomatic posts. Currently, he is president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and is a board member of No Greater Love. Bruce?
In my most serviceable Arabic this morning, Bismillah Rahmani Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. This morning, each of our voices is but one voice, but together, our voice this morning is loud and clear on this special day, this day that carries that hopeful title, International Day of Peace. We know, and how painfully we know, that peace is not universal. But yet today, as the United Nations begins its annual General Assembly meeting in New York City, that body once so aptly described by President Bush as the world's parliament of peace. And today, as those of the Jewish faith among us begin preparations for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, today we hope and pray together that all humankind will know peace and that the scourge of war will cease. All war is terrible, and no one knows that better than those who are asked to wage it, fight it. General Robert E. Lee, commanding his armies in the Civil War, at the Battle of looking down from the ridge above the battlefield, that bloody battlefield, is supposed to have said that it is good that war is so horrible, lest men become too comfortable with it. Or as someone else once said, young men fight old men's wars, and they die in the process of doing so. All war is terrible, we know that. But when it is children who die in war, it is doubly terrible. Today, on this International Day of Peace, we remember all who have suffered in war, and particularly these recent conflicts in the Middle East, but especially the children, those young lives that knew only hope and laughter, too young for their hope and laughter to be scarred by hate or pain. From those children who died as a consequence of the brutal invasion of Kuwait, to those Kurdish children who knew death on the mountains to the north and east of Iraq, where their parents had fled with them. And yes, the children of Iraq, of Yemen, of Jordan, and of other countries too. All of them, these children who die in war, young hearts and lives denied their dreams because of man's failing in the pursuit of peace. So we gather here today to remember, and yes, to weep in our hearts that we have failed them and the children have died. But more than that, we come here this morning to make a commitment. As we listen to these children among us this morning expressing their special pledge of peace, which they will do later in the program, to make a commitment that we will not fail them in their hopes and dreams, and that all of us, recalling the words of the psalmist, will work to make peace a pathway for our feet. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I would now like to turn the program over to Jim Ward, who will introduce our guests. Mr. Ward is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs and served as the Director of Consular Affairs for the Kuwait Task Force. He was instrumental in maintaining communications between the many embassies and consulates involved during the Persian Gulf War. Jim Ward.
Thank you very much and welcome. I'm here partly because, as was just mentioned, I was managing the consular portion of the task force during the Iraq-Kuwaiti War. I think perhaps the larger reason that I'm here is that I'm a parent. I have older children that are young adults that have lived in all parts of the world but always grew up free, and I have a very small child that I hope will grow up the same way. I'm here just to recognize, to thank all of you for coming, but to recognize in particular those representatives, first from the embassies of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United Kingdom, and Norway. From the State Department, my colleague, Ambassador John Bolton, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Office of International Organizational Affairs. From the White House, Nancy Beard-Dyke, who is with the National Security Council. And finally, as I leave the podium, I would like to just pay one special welcome to an individual who reminds us that we still have a long ways to go in certain parts of the world, and that's former hostage Robert Polhill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. No greater love felt it would be most fitting in this remembrance of children to have as our guest speaker a representative of UNICEF. Since 1946, UNICEF has been addressing the problems of children throughout the world. UNICEF has been deeply involved in meeting the needs of the children affected by the Persian Gulf conflicts. Representing UNICEF is Mr. Alex Palacios, Director of its Washington office. Alex?
Thank you. Thank you for having UNICEF here today on this day of remembrance for the children who were affected by the war in the Persian Gulf. I must say that UNICEF unfortunately knows all too well the situation of children caught in the midst of war. As was just mentioned, UNICEF was created shortly following the end of World War II, principally to address the tragic conditions of children left behind by the war in Eastern Europe, particularly. Shortly after 1950 or 1952, UNICEF, in fact, was asked to do the same in developing countries, and it is now working in 120 developing countries, many of which have, in the past decades, witnessed smaller but equally tragic wars. Just to mention a few: Lebanon, El Salvador, Angola, Mozambique, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And also recently Iraq and Iran, where UNICEF was working in both countries throughout that conflict. As you know, inevitably in the situation of war, at one point or another, one side or the other claims victory. But UNICEF has, in all occasions, noted that it seems that for children, war is always a lose-lose situation. We try very hard to work with the families of children who've died in wars, and we work with the children and the families that remain in the aftermath of war, and we know that they must be remembered, they must not be forgotten, and that the work never ends for these children. UNICEF was among the first agencies to enter Kuwait following the liberation, and we saw firsthand the consequences of aggression on the vulnerable young. Many of those children will need years of psychiatric help to help them overcome the violence and the aggression that affected their young lives. Also, a UNICEF team drove into Baghdad with UN clearance in the middle of the war to address the situation of Iraqi children as a result of the conflict on them. Of course, we traveled to the mountains of Turkey to address the harsh, inhuman conditions facing the Kurds who had fled. UNICEF has worked both in Israel and closely with Israel throughout the last 30 years. And I must say, as a parent, it just seems, parent of two small children, it seems to me the greatest tragedy of all to have to sit down in front of a small child and explain to them what a gas mask is and why they would have to use it. UNICEF mourned with each landing of a Scud missile in an Israeli city. For children, war is a lose-lose situation. Nobody wins. Special protection for children living in the midst of an armed conflict was given serious consideration at last September's World Summit for Children. The declaration produced by the 71 leaders attending the summit calls for consideration for the health, nutrition, and development needs for all children affected by armed conflict. The declaration also calls for speedy universal ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which would establish minimum international standards specifically for the protection of children caught in the midst of conflict. I'm pleased to say today that 95 countries have ratified the convention, and an additional 55 to 60 have at least signed. I'm hopeful that the United States will be among those on that list in the coming months. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. There are three major religious traditions in our Western civilization: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each of these religious traditions promotes peace and places the highest value on the lives of children. For example, Jesus said, "Anyone who brings harm to one of these little ones would be better drowned in the depths of the sea." Three children, one from each religious tradition, will read a short passage that emphasizes one of the themes of this ceremony. Dan Raphael Stern from Israel will read from the Hebrew Scriptures a passage from the book of Isaiah the prophet about God's promise to protect children. Bridget Monroe from the United States We'll read from the Christian Scriptures, a passage from the Gospel according to Matthew about the place of children in God's world. And Yasir al-Saidi from Saudi Arabia will read from the Islamic Scriptures a passage from the Quran about God's light and blessing. Dan Stern.
God consoles his children and takes pity on those who are afflicted. For we were saying, God has abandoned us. The Lord has forgotten us. But God replied, does a woman forget her baby or fail to cherish her child? Yet, even if these forget, I will never forget you. You, my children, who live in a peaceful home and in quiet dwellings.
At this time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" So he called a little child forward and set the child in front of them. Then he said, I tell you solemnly, unless you change and become like the other children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. See that you never despise any of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven are continually in the presence of my Father in heaven. It is never the will of your heavenly Father that one of these little ones should be lost.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله نور السماوات والأرض مثل نوري كمشكاة فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة الزجاجة كأنها كوكب دري يوقد من شجرة مباركة زيتونة لا شرقية ولا غربية يكاد زيتها يضيء لم تمسسه نار نور على نور يهدي الله لنوره من يشاء ويضرب الله الأمثال للناس والله بكل شيء عليم في بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه يسبح له فيها بالغدو والآصال رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة يخافون يوما تتقلب فيه القلوب والأبصار.
I would now like to introduce the founder of No Greater Love, who initiated this children's tribute today, Carmela Laspada.
The biggest gift I can give to you children is to convince you how wonderful it is to be a human being and how wonderfully special each person is. If all people could realize this, we would revere each other, and we could never have one human being killing another. We would never put any material thing of higher value than a human being. A famous musician, Pablo Casals, put it just right when he said, we should say to each child, do you know what you are? You are a marvel. You are unique. In all the world, there is no other child exactly like you. In the millions of years that have passed, there has never been a child like you. And when you grow up, can you then harm another who is like you, a marvel? You must cherish one another. You must work. We all must work to make this world worthy of its children. The theme of this year's International Day of Peace is Light a Candle. To pay special tribute to the children we remember today, we will have a symbolic roll call of the child victims of war. Among the children in the honor guard is one who has known the hostility of war firsthand. 10-year-old Nasreen Al-Khatib was taken hostage with her father in Iraq and held for 1 month in captivity. A group of children will light candles to honor the child victims we remember in the roll call. I know, at the end, see. First of all, we remember those infants who died before their first birthday. Now we remember the 1-year-olds who died. We remember the 2-year-olds who died. We remember the 3-year-olds who died. We remember the 4-year-olds who died. We remember the 5-year-olds who died. We remember the 6-year-olds who died. We remember the 7-year-olds who died. We remember the 8-year-olds who died. We remember the 9-year-olds who died. We remember the 10-year-olds who died. We remember the 11-year-olds who died. We remember the 12-year-olds who died. And finally, we light a candle for the adolescents who died. Even amid all our sadness for the many child victims of war, there are signs of hope. Many children who are committed to peace. The rainbow is one symbol. This symbol of children's hopes and dreams for happiness and a bright future. The children wanted a rainbow wreath, a symbol of hope, to surround the image of the child victims of war. The rainbow wreath is placed by Ahmed Gilad and Nasir al-Subai around the portrait representing the children.
On the day I was born, said my father, said he, I've an elegant legacy waiting for thee. 'Tis a rhyme for your lips and a smile for your heart, to sing whenever the world falls apart. Look to the rainbow, follow it over the hill and stream. Look to the rainbow, follow the children
Thousands of children all over the world have committed themselves to creating world peace in their lifetimes. They have made their commitment with the No Greater Love Pledge of Peace. The No Greater Love Children's Pledge of Peace laser disc, containing signatures of children from 100 countries, is on display at this ceremony. It was flown as part of the official flight kit aboard the Challenger, January 28, 1986. The disc was recovered after the tragedy and was displayed at the United Nations and the U.S. Capitol. To remember those children who died is one of the purposes of this event. The other purpose is to renew our commitment to working with all our strength to see that a crisis like this is never again resolved by the death of so many. This is the purpose of No Greater Love's Pledge of Peace. Nasir al-Subay from Kuwait will first recite the Pledge of Peace in Arabic. Then Sabria Stooks will lead the children from St. Thomas More School in reciting the pledge in English.
أعظم قسم للسلام مني لجميع الأطفال على وجه الأرض تذكرة وهدية إني قد أخذت عهدا على نفسي أن أعمل من أجل خلق مستقبل آمن لجميع البشرية. شكرا.
As a legacy and gift to the children who will be born and live on this planet Earth, I hereby commit myself to fostering peace. I promise to do everything I can to help create a common future of peace for all human beings.
Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be. With God as our Father, family all are we. Let us walk with each other